January 22nd, 1901. Queen Victoria is dead. Onto the throne steps her 59-year-old son, Edward VII. Europe doesn't celebrate. It panics, because the new king literally cannot go a day without a woman. Not his wife. Alexandra is still alive, still dutiful. Edward needs mistresses, plural, simultaneously. For 60 years, he's slept through Europe's aristocracy. Actresses, his friends' wives, ambassadors' daughters. Hotels installed special oversized beds just for the Prince of Wales and his conquests. Now this legendary seducer is King Emperor, ruler of 400 million people, head of the church that preaches marital fidelity. The question isn't whether he'll continue. Everyone knows he will. The question is, can the empire survive a king ruled by his appetites? What happens when mistresses know state secrets? How much does royal adultery cost the treasury? This is the story of 3 women who ruled a king. One became the world's first celebrity. One tried blackmail and nearly destroyed the crown. One held his hand as he died, with his wife's permission. Welcome to Edward VII's secret life, where an empire couldn't fill the void in one man's heart. To understand Edward's insatiable appetite for women, we must first understand the prison of his childhood. Born on November 9th, 1841, as Albert Edward, the future king grew up under the iron rule of Queen Victoria and her beloved husband, Prince Albert. They had a plan to create the perfect monarch, disciplined, moral, intellectual, devoted to duty above all else. The reality? They created the opposite. Young Bertie, as the family called him, was subjected to a brutal education regime. 6 days a week, from 8 in the morning until evening, tutors drilled him in languages, mathematics, history, and moral philosophy. No friends his own age, no normal childhood. Every mistake was documented, every failure reported to his parents with clinical precision. Prince Albert designed the curriculum himself, convinced that through sheer force of will, he could mold his son into an ideal ruler. Prince Albert had witnessed the disasters of royal indulgence. He knew the stories of George IV, the previous Prince of Wales who became king, whose dissipation and scandals had nearly destroyed the monarchy's reputation. Albert was determined that his son would be different, a philosopher king, a moral exemplar, a ruler who put duty before pleasure. But children are not clay. They are human beings, and when you squeeze too hard, something breaks. At 16 years old, Bertie was described by his tutors as listless, backward, and showing no interest in learning. What they didn't see, or chose not to, was a young man suffocating under impossible expectations. His mother openly preferred his siblings, particularly his older sister Vicky, who was everything Bertie wasn't, brilliant, studious, eager to please. His father regarded him with barely concealed disappointment, writing letters lamenting his son's intellectual shortcomings. The only person who truly loved him was his Danish nanny, who at least showed him human warmth. The young prince grew up feeling he could never measure up, never earn his parents' approval, never be good enough. He developed a stammer when nervous. He struggled with academics not because he was stupid, he wasn't, but because the pressure paralyzed him. Every lesson became a test he was failing. Every interaction with his father became a reminder of his inadequacy. Then came 1861, the year everything changed. At 19, Bertie was sent for military training with the Grenadier Guards at the Curragh camp in Ireland. Away from his parents for the first time, away from constant surveillance, his fellow officers, mostly young aristocrats who knew how to enjoy life, decided the virgin prince needed an education of a different kind. They had watched him struggle with the rigid formality of his upbringing. They saw a young man desperate for normal human connection, and they decided to provide it. Her name was Nellie Clifton, an actress. Some sources call her a courtesan, which in Victorian England was a polite way of saying high-class prostitute. She was 26 years old, experienced, probably quite beautiful, though no verified photographs survive. The officers smuggled her into Bertie's quarters at the Curragh camp one night in September 1861. What happened that night, we can only imagine. For Bertie, it must have been a revelation. For the first time in his life, someone wanted him not because he was the heir to the throne, not because they had to, but simply because he was a young man. The physical act itself, the warmth of another body, the intimacy, the pleasure, must have seemed like a door opening into a world he'd never known existed. But the consequences were catastrophic. Word of the affair reached Prince Albert within weeks. The moral paragon was horrified. His son, heir to the British throne, had fornicated with a common actress. Albert saw his entire educational project collapsing. All those years of careful instruction, all that moral philosophy, all those lessons in duty and self-control, wasted. In late November 1861, despite being seriously ill with what would prove to be typhoid fever, Prince Albert travelled to Cambridge, where Bertie was now studying, to personally confront his son with his shame. The confrontation was brutal. Albert walked with his son in the rain, lecturing him for hours about sin, duty, and the terrible burden of kingship. Bertie wept, apologized, promised to reform. But the damage was done, not to Bertie's character, but to Prince Albert's health. Prince Albert died 2 weeks later, on December 14th, 1861. He was only 42 years old. Queen Victoria never forgave her son. In her grief-maddened mind, Bertie had killed his own father. "I never can or shall look at him without a shudder," she wrote to her eldest daughter. For decades afterward, literally for the remaining 40 years of her life, she blamed Edward for Albert's death. Every time she looked at her son, she saw the man who had destroyed her beloved husband. The fact that Albert actually died of typhoid fever, contracted from the terrible sanitation at Windsor Castle, was irrelevant. The timing was enough. In Victoria's court, coincidence became damnation. Here's the terrible irony. Victoria's reaction ensured that Edward would become exactly what she feared. Denied his mother's love, excluded from any meaningful role in government, constantly reminded that he was a disappointment and a murderer, Edward sought validation the only way available to him, through women who desired him. And there were many who did. Because whatever his flaws as a scholar, Edward possessed something his education could never have taught: charm. Genuine, magnetic, irresistible charm. He knew how to make a woman feel like the only person in the room. He had a gift for small gestures, remembering a favorite flower, noticing a new dress, asking about a sick relative with genuine concern. He could tell a joke that would make a duchess laugh until she cried. In an age of stiff formality, when most aristocratic men treated conversation as a form of interrogation, Edward was warm and human. He was also, by March 1863, married. His bride was Princess Alexandra of Denmark, chosen by his parents specifically for her beauty, good nature, and malleability. She was 18. He was 21. The wedding at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on March 10, 1863, was the social event of the decade. Tens of thousands lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the beautiful Danish princess who would be their future queen. Alexandra was, by all accounts, extraordinarily beautiful. Tall at 5 feet 7 inches, graceful, with expressive dark eyes and a swan-like neck that set fashion trends across Europe. Women copied her hairstyles, her dresses, even the way she walked with a slight forward tilt. She was also kind, patient, genuinely fond of her husband, and deeply, tragically in love with him. Between 1864 and 1871, she gave him 6 children: Albert Victor, born in January 1864, George, born in June 1865, Louise, born in February 1867, Victoria, born in July 1868, Maud, born in November 1869, and Alexander John, born in April 1871, who died the next day. But she couldn't give him what he needed: his mother's approval, a meaningful role in statecraft, or relief from the crushing boredom of being Prince of Wales with nothing to do. Queen Victoria kept him away from all official papers, believing him too indiscreet and frivolous to be trusted with state secrets. She refused him any responsibilities beyond ceremonial duties. For 40 years, from 1861 until Victoria's death on January 22, 1901, Edward's only job was to wait for his mother to die. So he filled the void with pleasure, hunting at Sandringham, his country estate in Norfolk, horse racing at Ascot and Goodwood, gambling at the clubs of St. James's, gourmet dining at the finest restaurants in London and Paris, and above all, women. So many women. The Victorian era was named for his mother's strict morality, but behind the lace curtains, Britain's upper classes were as debauched as any French court. The difference was hypocrisy. In France, a king's mistress was official, recognized, given apartments at Versailles, even presented at court with a title. In England, everyone knew, but no one spoke of it. The newspapers couldn't print it. Libel laws and royal privilege protected the prince. Society gossip was conducted in whispers and coded language. Married women could have affairs, but they had to maintain appearances. The rule was simple. You could do anything as long as you weren't caught. Edward became a master of this double game. On the surface, a respectable prince, faithful husband, devoted father. He attended christenings and weddings. He opened hospitals and laid foundation stones. He gave speeches about duty and morality. In reality, he was conducting multiple affairs simultaneously, often with the wives of his own friends. The aristocracy developed an unspoken code. If the Prince of Wales desired your wife, you looked the other way. Some husbands even facilitated the affairs, hoping to gain royal favor, a title, a government position, membership in the prince's inner circle. By his 30s, Edward had developed a clear pattern in his choice of mistresses. He preferred married women, less risk of scandal, no expectations of marriage, and they understood the rules of discretion. Unmarried women were dangerous. They might expect him to marry them, or worse, get pregnant and create a succession crisis. He favored actresses and society women who moved in theatrical circles. They were beautiful, entertaining, knew how to keep secrets, and were outside the rigid caste system that otherwise constrained him. And he was drawn to strong, intelligent women who could match his wit and hold his interest beyond the bedroom. Edward was not a stupid man, despite his poor education. He liked women who could talk, who had opinions, who challenged him. His first serious post-marriage affair was probably with Lady Susan Vane Tempest, daughter of the Duke of Newcastle, sometime around 1864 or 1865. Then came Lady Filmer, the wife of a Member of Parliament in the late 1860s. Then Lady Mordaunt, whose husband created a spectacular scandal in 1870 by suing for divorce and naming the Prince of Wales as a co-respondent. Edward had to testify in court, standing in the witness box like a common defendant, denying adultery under oath while the entire nation read transcripts in their newspapers. Most historians believe he committed perjury. The judge, however, ruled in Edward's favor, accepting his denial. What else could he do? Calling the heir to the throne a liar would have created a constitutional crisis. But these were mere preludes. The women who would truly define Edward's life were yet to come. Women who would be more than passing fancies, more than brief affairs forgotten after a few months. Women who would shape the man who would eventually become king. 3 names stand above all others: Lily Langtry, Daisy Greville, and Alice Keppel. Each represented a different phase of Edward's life. Each played a different role in his emotional development. And each tells us something essential about the man behind the crown. But before we meet them, we must understand something crucial. Edward's affairs were not just personal indulgences, they were political dynamite. Every mistress was a potential spy, a point of leverage, a source of blackmail. Foreign governments watched his bedroom habits with intense interest, looking for ways to influence British policy through pillow talk. Ambitious families pushed their beautiful daughters toward him, hoping to gain access to royal favor. Journalists built entire careers on hints and innuendo, writing articles that said everything without saying anything, describing a certain royal personage and a beautiful society lady in ways that left no doubt who they meant. The security implications were serious. What if a mistress was actually a foreign agent? What if she extracted secrets about military preparations or diplomatic negotiations? What if she was being blackmailed by enemies of Britain? The government worried constantly, but they couldn't control the Prince of Wales. He was royal. He did what he wanted. And through it all, Alexandra endured. She grew partially deaf from an illness contracted during her pregnancy with Princess Louise in 1867, a condition called otosclerosis that gradually worsened until she was nearly deaf in both ears by her 50s. She walked with a slight limp after a bout of rheumatic fever in 1867 left her with a stiff knee, though she turned it into a fashion statement. The Alexandra limp became trendy among society women. She aged while Edward's mistresses remained perpetually in their 20s and 30s because he simply moved on to younger models when his current favorite began to show wrinkles. Yet she never divorced him, never publicly shamed him, never retreated from her duties as Princess of Wales. She appeared at his side at every official function, smiled for photographers, hosted dinners and receptions, raised their children. In private, she wept. Her letters to her family in Denmark reveal a woman deeply hurt by her husband's infidelities, desperately lonely, clinging to her children for emotional support. Was she a saint or a victim? A woman ahead of her time who understood that a royal marriage was a political arrangement, not a romance, or simply a product of her age with no other choice? Divorce was nearly impossible for a woman of her status. It would have meant scandal, loss of her children, exile from court. So she stayed, maintained her dignity, and found small revenges. She kept Edward's mistresses away from their children. She refused to acknowledge them socially when she could avoid it. She made sure everyone knew she was the wronged wife, the virtuous queen-in-waiting. These are questions we'll explore. But first, let's meet the woman who made Edward VII a public scandal, the Jersey Lily herself, Lily Langtry. In the spring of 1877, London society was abuzz with talk of a new beauty. She appeared seemingly from nowhere, this tall woman with an impossibly perfect profile, alabaster skin like carved marble, and a figure that made men forget to breathe. Her name, Emily Charlotte Le Breton, but everyone called her Lily, and she was about to become the first modern celebrity, famous simply for being famous, her image reproduced on postcards and advertisements across Britain, her face more recognizable than the Queen's. The 36-year-old Prince of Wales was utterly smitten from the moment he saw her. But who was Lily Langtry? The story begins not in London, but on the Channel Island of Jersey, where she was born on October 13th, 1853. Her father was the Very Reverend William Courbet Le Breton, Dean of Jersey, a respected churchman with a prominent position in the island's small society. Her mother was Emily Martin, daughter of a wealthy merchant family, a society beauty in her youth who had married well. Lily grew up in a lovely stone house called the Rectory, running wild on the beaches, riding horses bareback, swimming in the sea in an era when most respectable girls were confined to drawing rooms and needlework. She was, by her own admission, a tomboy, tall for a woman of her era at 5 feet 8 inches, athletic, with a directness that shocked proper Victorian ladies. She climbed trees, explored caves, sailed boats. Her father, who had wanted sons, indulged her. Her 6 brothers treated her as one of them. She grew up thinking she could do anything men could do, a radical notion for a girl born in 1853. But she was also beautiful, extraordinarily, almost impossibly beautiful. Her face had perfect classical proportions, the kind of symmetry that artists dream of painting. High cheekbones, a straight nose, full lips, and most striking of all, a long, graceful neck that seemed to go on forever. Her hair was thick and dark, her eyes deep blue, her skin flawless. By her teenage years, Lily was easily the most beautiful girl on Jersey. At 20 years old, in March 1874, she made what would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. She married Edward Langtry, a widowed shipowner who was 27. Why? Probably boredom. Jersey was small, provincial, suffocating for a young woman of Lily's ambition and energy. She had read about London in books and newspapers, the theatres, the parties, the excitement. Edward Langtry promised escape. He claimed to have money, owned a yacht, moved in society circles. What Lily didn't realize was that he was also a dull, alcoholic bore who would prove utterly incapable of managing his finances or his wife. The couple moved to London in 1876, renting a modest house on Eaton Place in Belgravia. They had little money. Edward's wealth was greatly exaggerated, and he was already drinking heavily and gambling badly, and no social connections. Lily was beautiful but unknown, a provincial nobody in the world's greatest metropolis. She spent her days wandering the streets, looking in shop windows she couldn't afford, watching the fashionable world pass by without acknowledging her existence. Then came the moment that changed everything. In May 1877, at a small evening party, Lily met Lord Ranelagh, a prominent aristocrat and patron of the arts, and Sir John Everett Millais, one of Britain's most famous painters and a founding member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Millais was stunned by Lily's beauty. That perfect Grecian profile, the swan neck, the flawless complexion that seemed to glow in candlelight. He stared at her for several minutes, making her uncomfortable, before approaching and asking if she would model for him. She agreed, flattered and curious. The painting, titled A Jersey Lily, caused a sensation when exhibited at the Royal Academy that summer. Suddenly, this unknown woman's face was everywhere. Art critics raved. Society women demanded to know who she was. Her image was reproduced in newspapers and magazines. Within weeks, Lily Langtry went from nobody to the most talked-about woman in London. The Prince of Wales first saw her at a supper party hosted by Sir Alan Young in late May 1877. According to multiple witnesses, he simply stared. He stopped mid-conversation, his fork halfway to his mouth, and stared at this woman across the room. After dinner, he approached the hostess and demanded an introduction. Not requested, demanded. He was the Prince of Wales. He got what he wanted. By the end of the evening, Edward had claimed the seat next to Lily at supper and monopolized her completely, ignoring everyone else, talking to her for hours. What did he see in her? Beauty, certainly, but London had many beautiful women. Aristocratic ladies with impeccable pedigrees, professional beauties who made a career of being admired, actresses who knew how to present themselves. Lily offered something more: naturalness. She spoke her mind without the calculated flattery that most people used with royalty. She didn't simper or flutter her eyelashes. She had a wicked sense of humor and wasn't afraid to tease him. She told him when she disagreed with something he said. And crucially, she treated the prince not as royalty, but as a man, as someone interesting in his own right, not just because of his position. In a world of suffocating protocol where everyone watched their words around him, this was revolutionary and intoxicating. The affair began almost immediately in the summer of 1877. Edward was not subtle. He had never learned to be. He attended every social event where Lily appeared, arriving late if necessary to ensure he saw her. He sent her flowers daily, usually gardenias, which became her signature flower and which she wore pinned to her dress. He arranged for her husband to be invited on long sailing trips, alone, while Lily remained in London. He gave her a house on Norfolk Street in Mayfair, one of the most fashionable addresses in London. Within months, everyone in London society knew that Mrs. Langtry was the prince's mistress. The newspapers couldn't print it directly, but they found ways. References to a certain royal personage seen entering the home of a celebrated beauty became regular items in gossip columns. For Lily, the affair was transformative, but not in the way Victorian moralists would have predicted. She didn't become a tragic, fallen woman, destroyed by shame. She became powerful. Doors that would have remained forever closed suddenly opened. Hostesses who would have snubbed a provincial nobody now begged her to attend their parties, because where Lily went, the prince followed. Dressmakers gave her free gowns, knowing that whatever Lily wore would become fashionable. Jewelers loaned her pieces for special events. She received up to 200 letters a day from admirers, men proposing marriage or affairs, women asking for fashion advice, artists begging to paint her. Edward showered her with gifts and jewelry, though characteristically many of these were actually gifts from other admirers that he appropriated and presented as his own generosity. He was notoriously stingy with his own money, despite his massive income from the Duchy of Cornwall. But he was generous in other ways. He introduced her to everyone who mattered in British society. Through him, she met Oscar Wilde in 1878, and the brilliant young playwright became a close friend, writing poems about her beauty and calling her his muse. She met James Abbott McNeill Whistler, the American painter, who created multiple portraits of her. She became friends with Sarah Bernhardt, the legendary French actress, who was performing in London and recognized a kindred spirit, another woman using beauty and intelligence to carve out power in a man's world. But here's what made Lily fundamentally different from traditional royal mistresses. She refused to be defined solely by her relationship with the prince. She had ambitions of her own, a sense of her own worth that didn't depend on his favor. The prince's nightly visits followed an elaborate ritual. He would arrive around 11 at night, after dining elsewhere. Edward never missed dinner at one of London's finest restaurants or private clubs. He was a gourmet, obsessed with food, and would eat enormous multi-course meals even before visiting Lily. She would be dressed impeccably. She understood that part of her role was to look beautiful even at midnight, her dark hair perfectly coiffed in the latest style, wearing one of the fashionable gowns that she made famous by wearing them. The house would be lit with candles and gas lamps, creating an intimate atmosphere. Servants would be dismissed for the night, ensuring privacy. They would talk first. Edward loved gossip, clever observations about people they both knew. Lily had a gift for this, a sharp eye for human folly and pretension. They would drink champagne. Edward's favorite was Moet and Chandon, which he consumed in vast quantities. Lily would entertain him with stories, impressions, jokes. She had a gift for mimicry, imitating society figures so perfectly, capturing their voices, their mannerisms, their silly affectations, that Edward would weep with laughter. She was irreverent about social pomposity, mocking the very aristocrats who fawned over her during the day. She made him feel young, alive, freed from the suffocating formality of royal life. Then, presumably, they would retire upstairs to more intimate activities. Lily never wrote explicitly about the sexual aspect of their relationship, but we can infer from Edward's reputation and the duration of the affair that he found her satisfying. Edward had specific tastes. He liked creative positions, enjoyed using furniture specially designed for his considerable bulk. He would eventually weigh over 240 pounds and had remarkable stamina for a man his age. Lily, despite her provincial upbringing, clearly learned to accommodate these preferences. But Edward demanded more than just sex. He wanted companionship, entertainment, someone who could make him laugh and forget his troubles. Lily provided this brilliantly. She was never boring, never predictable. She could discuss art, theatre, literature, all subjects that interested Edward far more than politics or government. She could listen sympathetically to his complaints about his mother, his frustrations at being powerless despite his position. She made him feel understood in a way his wife never could. The affair lasted approximately 3 years as the primary relationship, from summer 1877 until early 1880. For 3 years, Lily was the unofficial queen of London society, the woman every man wanted and every woman envied. Then something happened that shocked everyone. Lily became pregnant in autumn 1879. This was disaster. Edward had been careful with his other mistresses, or they had been careful. Pregnancy meant scandal, potential exposure, constitutional crisis. The questions were immediate and terrifying. Whose child was it? Edward's? Her husband's? Another lover's? The Prince of Wales could not acknowledge a bastard by a commoner married to another man. The legal implications alone were staggering. It could be construed as adultery by the heir to the throne, potentially affecting the succession. Edward's solution was cruel but practical from his perspective: immediate abandonment. He withdrew his support in early 1880. The nightly visits stopped abruptly. The flowers ceased arriving. His representatives made it clear she was to expect nothing further. Society, taking its cue from royalty, immediately dropped her. Within weeks, Lily went from the most sought-after woman in London to a social pariah. The same hostesses who had begged for her presence now refused to acknowledge her in the street. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her. The letters of admiration dried up. She gave birth to a daughter, Jeanne-Marie Langtry, on March 8, 1881, in Paris, far from English eyes and English scandal. The child was almost certainly not Edward's, but rather the product of an affair with Prince Louis of Battenberg, a handsome young naval officer who would later become First Sea Lord. Louis was 25 years old, 6 years younger than Lily, and had pursued her aggressively during Edward's increasing neglect in late 1879. Edward Langtry, her legal husband, accepted paternity in name only, though everyone knew he hadn't touched his wife in years and was likely impotent from alcohol abuse. Abandoned by the prince, shunned by society, nearly penniless. Her worthless husband had drunk and gambled away what little money they had. Lily faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could retreat into shame, return to Jersey, live quietly in obscurity, become another cautionary tale of a woman destroyed by royal favor and her own ambition. Instead, at 28 years old, she became an actress. In December 1881, Lily made her theatrical debut at the Haymarket Theatre in London, playing Kate Hardcastle in Oliver Goldsmith's comedy She Stoops to Conquer. It was audacious. Respectable women did not go on stage. Acting was not considered a proper profession. Actresses were barely a step above prostitutes in public opinion, assumed to be sexually available, morally loose. But Lily had nothing left to lose, and she discovered, somewhat to her own surprise, that she had talent. She wasn't a great actress in the Sarah Bernhardt mold. She lacked the training, the technique, the emotional range, but she had presence, charisma, and most importantly, fame. People came to see Lily Langtry regardless of what she was performing. Her beauty alone was worth the ticket price, and she was good enough. She learned quickly, worked hard, and improved with every performance. The prince, to his credit, attended opening night. He sat in a private box, applauded enthusiastically at the curtain call, and let it be known that he approved of her new career. It was a signal. Lily might be his former mistress, but she was not to be completely destroyed. Society could accept her in this new role. As an actress, she existed outside the normal social hierarchy. She could be admired without being invited to dinner parties. And they did admire her. Lily became a theatrical sensation. She toured Britain throughout 1882 and 1883, earning substantial sums, far more than most actresses. In 1882, she made her first tour of America, and American audiences loved her even more than British ones. She toured the United States multiple times between 1882 and 1897, performing in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. American millionaires showered her with gifts and attention. One of these millionaires was Freddie Gebhardt, a wealthy sportsman and heir to a massive fortune. He became her lover around 1883, when Lily was 30 and Freddie was 27. Unlike Edward, Freddie was generous with his own money. He bought her jewels, racehorses, a private railroad car for her American tours. He set her up in a mansion in New York. For several years, Lily lived like a queen, wealthier than she had ever been even as the prince's mistress. But Lily was also smart about money. She invested her earnings wisely, in real estate, in racehorses that actually won races, in business ventures. By her 40s, she was genuinely wealthy in her own right, not dependent on any man's favor. In 1897, after Edward Langtry finally died from his alcoholism in October of that year, Lily married again at 44 years old. Her new husband was Hugo de Bath, the son of a baronet, who was only 25 years old, 19 years younger than Lily. It was a scandal, of course. People said she'd bought herself a young husband. But Hugo seemed genuinely fond of her, and the marriage lasted. When his father died in 1907, Hugo inherited the baronetcy, and Lily became Lady de Bath. The Jersey girl who had started as a provincial, nobody had ended up with a title after all, without needing the Prince of Wales. Edward and Lily maintained a friendship of sorts after the affair ended. When he became king in 1901, she wrote to congratulate him. He replied warmly. She was not invited to the coronation in 1902. That would have been too much for Queen Alexandra, who had never forgiven any of Edward's mistresses. But they occasionally met at race meetings at Ascot or Goodwood, exchanging pleasantries like old friends, which, in a complicated way, they were. They had shared something important in their youth, even if it had ended badly. Lily lived until February 12, 1929, dying in Monaco at 75 years old. By then, she was a relic of another age, the Edwardian era already seeming impossibly distant, like something from a history book. The world had changed beyond recognition. World War I had destroyed the old aristocratic order. The Russian Revolution had swept away the czars. Women had won the vote. She had outlived Edward by 19 years, outlived most of her contemporaries, outlived the empire that had both celebrated and condemned her. What was her legacy? She proved that a royal mistress could survive, could reinvent herself, could refuse to be defined by one man's desire or one relationship. She was the first woman to leverage fame itself into power and wealth, the first modern celebrity in the way we understand the term today. She turned scandal into currency, using notoriety to build a career that would have been impossible otherwise. And she did it all with grace, wit, and an unshakable sense of her own worth. But for Edward, Lily was ultimately unsatisfying in a deeper way. She was too independent, too ambitious, too much her own person. He wanted a mistress who would center her life entirely around him, someone who would be there whenever he wished, make no demands, cause no trouble, and devote herself completely to his happiness. He found her in Frances Evelyn Greville, Countess of Warwick, and she would prove to be far more dangerous than Lily Langtry ever was. If Lily Langtry represented Edward's public scandal and his first great passion after marriage, Frances Evelyn Greville, known to everyone as Daisy, represented his midlife crisis, his most passionate affair, and ultimately the relationship that nearly destroyed him politically. She was the woman who got closest to his heart, and therefore the woman who could hurt him most. Born Frances Evelyn Maynard on December 10th, 1861. The same year Prince Albert died of typhoid and Queen Victoria began blaming Edward for his father's death. Daisy was literally born into wealth and privilege beyond most people's imagination. Her father, Charles Maynard, Viscount Maynard, died when she was just 3 years old in 1865, leaving her estates and income worth over £30,000 a year, an astronomical sum equivalent to tens of millions in today's money. At 3 years old, little Daisy was one of the richest women in England. She grew up at Easton Lodge in Essex, a magnificent estate with hundreds of acres of parkland, ornate gardens, and a house filled with Renaissance art. Beautiful from childhood, with auburn hair that glinted red gold in sunlight, violet blue eyes that seemed to change color with her moods, and a curvaceous figure that fit perfectly the aesthetics of the late Victorian era, Daisy was groomed from birth for a brilliant marriage. She was educated by governesses, taught French and Italian, learned to play the piano and sing, was instructed in all the accomplishments expected of an aristocratic young lady. In April 1881, at 19 years old, the same year Lily Langtry gave birth to a daughter in Paris, Daisy married Francis Greville, Lord Brooke, heir to the earldom of Warwick. It should have been perfect. He was handsome, titled from an old aristocratic family. The wedding was spectacular, attended by the Prince and Princess of Wales and covered extensively in society pages. It was a disaster from the start. Francis was dull, obsessed with hunting and shooting, utterly incapable of matching his wife's vivacious personality, sharp intelligence, and need for intellectual stimulation. He could talk for hours about pheasants and dogs, but had no interest in art, literature, politics, or any of the subjects that fascinated Daisy. Within a year, she was bored. Within 2 years, she was actively unhappy. Within 3 years, she was looking elsewhere for excitement and emotional connection. She found it in Lord Charles Beresford, a rakish naval officer who was everything her husband wasn't: charming, adventurous, passionate, dangerous. Beresford was handsome in a swashbuckling way, with a reputation as both a war hero and a seducer. They began an affair in 1885, when Daisy was 24. It was intense, reckless, all-consuming, the kind of passionate affair that Victorian society theoretically condemned, but secretly found thrilling. They barely bothered to hide it, meeting openly at social events, disappearing together during weekend house parties. The affair might have continued indefinitely if not for a catastrophic miscalculation. In 1887, when Daisy was 26, she discovered that Beresford's wife, Mina, was pregnant. Furious at what she saw as a betrayal, the hypocrisy is stunning given that Daisy herself was married, she wrote Beresford an angry letter. It was emotional, indiscreet, and made absolutely clear the nature of their intimate relationship. She accused him of betraying her, of breaking promises, of loving his wife more than her. Beresford, demonstrating the carelessness that characterized his entire approach to the affair, left the letter lying around in his home. His wife found it. Mina Beresford was not the type to quietly accept her husband's infidelity and her own humiliation. She was also smart, calculating, and now possessed a weapon that could destroy one of the most prominent society women in England. She threatened to publish Daisy's letter, to show it to newspapers, to circulate it among society, to make Daisy's adultery undeniably public. This would mean complete social ruin for Daisy. Divorced women were outcasts, proven adulteresses were worse. Desperate, terrified, Daisy did something incredibly foolish. She turned to the Prince of Wales for help in early 1888. Edward was 46 years old at this point. Daisy was 26, a 20-year age gap. He had known her socially for years, always attracted to her beauty, vivacity, and that dangerous energy she radiated. Now she came to him vulnerable, tearful, begging for his intervention. For Edward, who loved playing the hero, who enjoyed wielding power, and who was undeniably attracted to this beautiful young woman in distress, it was irresistible. Edward personally confronted Mina Beresford, using every ounce of royal pressure he could muster. He essentially threatened her, refusing royal favor, social ostracism, damage to her husband's naval career. Through a combination of intimidation and negotiation, he secured the letter's return to Daisy. The crisis was averted. The price? Daisy became his mistress in 1889, when she was 28 and he was 48 years old. For Edward, it was as close to perfect as he would ever find. Daisy was beautiful, passionate, and unlike Lily Langtry, she was his social equal, an aristocrat who could appear at any society event without raising eyebrows, who belonged at court functions, who knew everyone who mattered. She was married, which meant theoretically less risk of pregnancy complications and scandal. And she seemed utterly devoted to him, willing to arrange her entire life around his visits, his needs, his desires. For the next 9 years, from 1889 until 1898, Daisy was the undisputed official mistress of the Prince of Wales. She called him "my own darling love" in letters. He signed his letters to her as "your only love." They were about as discreet as a forest fire. Everyone in aristocratic society knew, gossiped about it constantly, and considered Daisy's position as semi-official. Edward would visit Eastern Lodge regularly, sometimes for weekends, sometimes for weeks at a time, treating it like his private retreat. Daisy redecorated rooms specifically for his comfort, installing oversized furniture to accommodate his considerable bulk. He was gaining weight steadily throughout the 1980s, ensuring the beds were specially constructed to support his weight during his intimate activities. She hired French chefs who could prepare the elaborate multi-course meals he demanded. She organized shooting parties where Edward could hunt pheasants and deer. She arranged gambling nights where he could play baccarat and whist for high stakes. She created elaborate entertainments, charades, theatrical performances by professional actors, musical evenings. Her husband Francis, who inherited his father's title to become the 5th Earl of Warwick in 1893 when his father died, played along with the arrangement. He had his own mistresses, spent most of his time at his hunting estates, and appreciated the royal connection. Being the husband of the prince's mistress brought its own benefits in terms of social position and political influence. The three of them formed a very Victorian arrangement. Appearances maintained, everyone understanding the reality, no one speaking of it openly. The ritual of Edward's visits was elaborate and followed strict protocols. He would arrive with his entourage. He never traveled alone, always bringing staff, sometimes bringing other guests to maintain appearances. Daisy would greet him publicly as the Prince of Wales, not as her lover. There would be elaborate dinners with multiple courses. Edward typically ate 8 to 10 courses, consuming vast quantities of food and wine. After dinner, there would be entertainment in the drawing room, music, conversation, perhaps games or cards. Other guests would gradually retire, leaving Edward and Daisy alone. Then, late at night, when the house was quiet, Edward would make his way to Daisy's private apartments. What did they do there during those long nights? Beyond the obvious physical intimacy, they talked endlessly. Edward poured out his frustrations about his mother who refused to trust him with any real responsibilities, about the boredom of his ceremonial duties, about feeling like a prisoner of his position. Daisy listened, sympathized, reassured him of his importance. She laughed at his jokes, no matter how many times she'd heard them. She gossiped with him about mutual acquaintances. She made him feel important, desired, younger than his years. But Daisy was not content to be merely a mistress, a beautiful ornament in the prince's life. She had a mind of her own, and as the 1890s progressed, that mind began to develop political opinions, radical ones that would ultimately destroy her relationship with Edward. Somehow, impossibly, this incredibly wealthy aristocrat living in absolute luxury became a socialist. Not a moderate reformer interested in incremental change, an actual socialist who believed in workers' rights, redistribution of wealth, the end of aristocratic privilege, and fundamental transformation of British society. The exact causes of this conversion are debated by historians. Perhaps genuine compassion for the poor, perhaps rebellion against the emptiness of her own privileged life, perhaps boredom seeking new excitement. Whatever the reason, by the mid-1890s Daisy was hosting socialist thinkers at Eastern Lodge, the same drawing rooms where she had entertained the prince, now filled with radical intellectuals. She became friends with H.G. Wells, the science fiction writer and Fabian socialist, who found the spectacle of a wealthy countess spouting socialist rhetoric both amusing and useful for his causes. She befriended George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and social critic, who was less impressed. He found her political understanding superficial and her continued enjoyment of luxury hypocritical. She met Sidney and Beatrice Webb, founders of the Fabian Society, who were initially hopeful she might fund their causes. She began giving speeches about workers' rights and the evils of capitalism, while still maintaining her own enormous estates, her staff of dozens of servants, her collections of jewelry and art, her stable of racehorses. Edward was appalled. Politics bored him at the best of times. He had spent his entire life excluded from any real political power and had developed a deep indifference to policy debates. But radical politics? Socialism? That was dangerous. It threatened the entire social order that gave him his position. He tried to persuade Daisy to stop, to give up her dangerous new friends and their revolutionary ideas. She ignored him, perhaps even became more extreme out of defiance. The affair began to sour around 1896 or 1897, when Edward was in his mid-50s and Daisy in her mid-30s. He was aging visibly, growing stouter. He would eventually have a 48-inch waist, more irritable, suffering from bronchitis and shortness of breath. She was still beautiful, but no longer the fresh-faced young woman he'd first desired, and she was increasingly occupied with her political activities, less available for the constant attention he demanded. They argued about her socialism. He felt she didn't respect him anymore. She felt he didn't understand the importance of her work. The passion cooled, the visits became less frequent, the letters less affectionate. Then came the brutal ending in 1898. Edward wrote Daisy a letter, cold, formal, devastating in its lack of emotion. He essentially ended their intimate relationship, making clear that while they could remain friends in public, he was no longer interested in her as a lover. He was 57, she was 37. After 9 years as the prince's official mistress, Daisy was being discarded for younger women. Exactly what had happened to Lily Langtry 2 decades earlier. Daisy was devastated. She wept for days. She had genuinely loved Edward, or convinced herself she had. She had reorganized her entire life around him. And now he was gone, moving on to other women while she faced middle age alone. But unlike Lily, who had accepted her dismissal and moved on to build a new life, Daisy didn't walk away quietly. She kept Edward's letters, every single one, dozens of them, written over nearly a decade. Some were extremely explicit about their sexual relationship. Others discussed political matters that Edward shouldn't have shared with anyone outside government. All of them proved conclusively that the Prince of Wales had conducted a long-term adulterous affair, and she let it be known that she had these letters. Discreetly, through intermediaries, but unmistakably, she had them, she wasn't giving them up, and the implied threat was clear. This was blackmail. Not crude, not explicit, but blackmail nonetheless. Edward was furious but also terrified. By 1898, his mother, Queen Victoria, was 80 years old and clearly declining. He would soon be king. The thought of those letters surfacing, letters proving his adultery, his deceptions, his complete disregard for his marriage vows, was nightmarish. It could damage the monarchy's reputation, possibly trigger constitutional debates about his fitness to rule. Through intermediaries and lawyers, Edward tried to retrieve the letters. He offered money, substantial sums. Daisy refused to surrender them. She claimed they were her safeguard, her insurance that Edward wouldn't completely abandon her financially and socially. For years, those letters hung over Edward like a sword of Damocles. He paid her money, ostensibly for other reasons, but really as hush money to keep her quiet. When Edward became king on January 22, 1901, after Queen Victoria's death, the problem became even more acute. A sitting monarch being blackmailed by a former mistress was intolerable. But still, Daisy wouldn't give up the letters. When Edward died on May 6, 1910, after a series of heart attacks at age 68, Daisy was 48 years old, and she still had the letters. By 1914, Daisy was desperate for money. Her socialist activities had alienated many of her wealthy friends and patrons. Her own finances, despite her enormous income, were in complete disarray. She spent extravagantly on her political causes, managed money poorly, and made bad investments. World War I was beginning, and she saw an opportunity. She approached publishers, offering to sell Edward VII's letters to her. The scandal would be enormous. Intimate letters from a deceased king, revealing his private life in shocking detail. Publishers were interested, sensing a bestseller. But Daisy hadn't counted on the determination of the royal family to protect their reputation. King George V, Edward's son and the current monarch, was horrified. The government was alarmed. They couldn't allow this publication. It would damage the monarchy at a time when Britain needed national unity for the war effort. What happened next remains somewhat murky, but the outcome is clear. Daisy was stopped. Some historians believe she was paid off, given a substantial sum to surrender the letters and abandon publication. Others believe she was threatened, with prosecution for some legal violation, with complete social ostracism, with the withdrawal of her government pension. Probably it was a combination of both, carrot and stick. The letters were retrieved, and Daisy's memoirs, when finally published in 1931, were heavily sanitized, removing all the most compromising material. Daisy lived until July 26, 1938, dying at 76 after a long decline into poverty and obscurity. Her vast wealth had evaporated through poor management and generous or reckless spending on political causes. The socialist countess ended her days in reduced circumstances, dependent on the charity of friends, a cautionary tale of how even enormous wealth can disappear. What was her significance in Edward's life? She represented his deepest emotional connection, the closest he came to genuine love with someone other than his wife. She also represented his inability to separate personal feeling from his need for control and deference. When Daisy developed independent political opinions that challenged his worldview, he couldn't accept it. He wanted a mistress, not an equal partner. And when she proved inconveniently independent, he discarded her, but discovered too late that some women can't be easily discarded. But Daisy wasn't Edward's last great love. There would be one more woman who would define the final years of his life, who would be with him when he became king, who would hold his hand as he died. The woman who proved to be perfect for him in ways Lily and Daisy never were, Alice Keppel. Alice Frederica Keppel was born Alice Edmonston on April 29, 1868, making her 27 years younger than Edward. Her family was respectable but not wealthy, minor Scottish gentry with more breeding than money. In 1891, at 23, she married George Keppel, the youngest son of the Earl of Albemarle. It was a love match, unusually, but George had no money and no prospects beyond his military salary as an officer in the Gordon Highlanders. Alice was beautiful in the robust, healthy way that Edwardian England admired, tall at nearly 5 feet 9 inches, with an hourglass figure, auburn hair, green eyes, and a peacock complexion. But more than physical beauty, Alice possessed something rarer: social intelligence. She understood people, understood power dynamics, understood how to make herself indispensable without making demands. She met Edward in February 1898 at a party at Lady Caroline's house, the same year Edward was ending his affair with Daisy Greville. Edward was 56, Alice was 29, a 27-year age gap. He was immediately attracted, not just to her beauty but to her manner. Alice was sophisticated without being intimidating, warm without being clingy, clever without showing off her intelligence. She laughed at his jokes, but not sycophantically. She was interested in what he said, but not obsequious. And crucially, she made it clear from the beginning that she understood the rules of being a royal mistress. The affair began within weeks. By the spring of 1898, Alice Keppel was established as Edward's new official mistress, a position she would hold until his death 12 years later. What made Alice different from Edward's previous mistresses? She was absolutely discreet. She understood that her role was to provide comfort and pleasure without causing scandal. She never made scenes, never showed jealousy when Edward flirted with other women, never demanded more than he was willing to give. She accepted the limitations of their relationship from the beginning. Alice also understood something crucial that Lily and Daisy hadn't. Edward didn't want to be challenged or reformed. He wanted to be accepted exactly as he was: indulgent, pleasure-loving, emotionally needy. Alice provided this acceptance completely. She listened to his complaints without offering solutions. She sympathized with his frustrations without pushing him to change. She created a space where he could relax and be himself. More remarkably, Alice managed her relationship with Queen Alexandra brilliantly. Instead of becoming Alexandra's enemy, she cultivated a strange kind of understanding with the Queen. Alexandra knew about Alice, of course. Everyone did. But Alice never flaunted the relationship, never humiliated Alexandra publicly, and showed the Queen appropriate respect. In return, Alexandra came to tolerate Alice in a way she never had Edward's other mistresses. It was a cynical arrangement. Alexandra essentially accepted that her husband needed a mistress and preferred it be someone like Alice who at least had good manners. Alice's husband George also played his role perfectly. He accepted his wife's affair with the prince, later king, benefited from royal favor in his career, and maintained his dignity through a combination of genuine affection for Alice and practical calculation. The Keppels received a house in Portman Square, a fashionable London address. George received military promotions and sinecures. Their 2 daughters, Violet, born 1894, and Sonia, born 1900, grew up in luxury and privilege far beyond what George's income could have provided. When Edward became king on January 22, 1901, at 59 years old, after Queen Victoria's death, Alice's position became even more delicate. She was now the mistress of the reigning monarch, not just the Prince of Wales. The scrutiny intensified, but Alice navigated it perfectly. She never presumed on Edward's new position. She didn't seek official recognition or titles. She remained in the background, available when he wanted her, invisible when he didn't. Edward's routine with Alice was comfortable, settled, utterly different from the passionate intensity of his earlier affairs. He would visit her at Portman Square several times a week, usually in the afternoon. They would have tea. Edward loved tea despite his German ancestry, consuming it with cakes and sandwiches. They would talk about society gossip, about his official duties, about their mutual friends. Sometimes he would play bridge, a card game he loved. Then they would retire to her bedroom for an hour or two before he returned to his official duties. It was domestic, almost married in its routine, which was exactly what Edward needed by this point in his life. He was aging rapidly. His health was deteriorating. He suffered from chronic bronchitis made worse by his heavy smoking, cigars. He was enormously overweight. He had shortness of breath. He had been waiting to be king for 60 years, and now that he finally had the crown, he discovered the job was exhausting and not particularly enjoyable. Alice provided refuge. With her, he didn't have to be the king. He could be simply Bertie, the man, tired and aging and needing comfort. She asked nothing except to be allowed to provide that comfort. It was the perfect arrangement for his final years. Edward's reign as king lasted only 9 years, from 1901 until 1910. He was already old when he ascended the throne, already worn out by decades of pleasure-seeking and frustration. His health declined steadily throughout the 1900s, despite multiple trips to continental spas and his doctor's increasingly desperate attempts to get him to lose weight and stop smoking. In April 1910, Edward caught a cold that developed into bronchitis and then pneumonia. He refused to stop his official duties or social activities, insisting on dining out and attending the theatre, even as he could barely breathe. By early May, it was clear he was dying. He suffered a series of heart attacks, each weakening him further. Alice Keppel was summoned to Buckingham Palace on May 6, 1910. In an extraordinary gesture, Queen Alexandra allowed Edward's mistress to visit him on his deathbed. Alice sat beside him, holding his hand, as he drifted in and out of consciousness. He died at 11:45 p.m. that night, surrounded by his family, and Alice. After his death, Alexandra thanked Alice for making Edward's final years happy. It was a moment of remarkable grace from a woman who had endured decades of humiliation. Alice left the palace in tears, her role as royal mistress over. She was 42 years old and had just lost the man who had been the center of her life for 12 years. Alice lived until September 11th, 1947, dying in Italy at 79. She had a long, interesting life after Edward. She traveled extensively, had other affairs, including possibly with the Italian Prime Minister, saw her daughters grow up and marry. Her great-granddaughter is Camilla, Queen Consort of the United Kingdom, wife of King Charles III, a fact that has given Alice a strange footnote in history, as though the bloodline of royal mistresses continues into the present day. What was Alice Keppel's legacy? She proved that a royal mistress could succeed by being exactly what was needed, no more, no less. She had no grand ambitions, no political causes, no desire for public recognition. She simply provided comfort to a lonely, aging man who happened to be king. In that limited but important role, she was perfect. Edward VII died on May 6, 1910, at 68 years old. He had waited 6 decades to become king and reigned for only 9 years. His obituaries focused on his diplomatic successes, the Entente Cordiale with France, improved relations with Russia, his role as Edward the Peacemaker. But everyone knew the other side of his legacy. The mistresses, the scandals, the life of pleasure that made him both loved and mocked. Did Edward's mistresses influence British history? Less than you might expect. Unlike French royal mistresses who wielded genuine political power, Edward's women were kept separate from affairs of state. Lily Langtry never influenced policy. Daisy Greville's socialism alarmed Edward, but didn't change his conservative political views. Alice Keppel provided comfort, but not counsel on government matters. But they influenced Edward himself profoundly. They filled the enormous void in his life, created by his mother's rejection and his exclusion from power. They made him feel desired, important, young. They provided the emotional support his wife couldn't or wouldn't give. In that sense, they shaped the man who became king, for better and worse. Edward's son, George V, who succeeded him, was utterly different. Faithful to his wife, devoted to duty, morally strict. It was as though George had seen his father's example and decided to do the opposite in every way. The freewheeling Edwardian era ended abruptly with Edward's death, replaced by George's more restrained and respectable reign. But Edward's legacy lived on in other ways. He had shown that even in the supposedly moral Victorian and Edwardian age, the rules didn't apply to everyone. That wealth and power could buy freedom from conventional morality. That a man could be both respected and debauched, both king and adulterer. Whether that's a legacy to be proud of is another question entirely. And what of the women themselves? They show us something important about the limited options available to women in that era, even beautiful, intelligent women. They could marry according to their parents' wishes or remain unmarried and dependent. They could be respectable and poor or scandalous and wealthy. Royal mistresses like Lily, Daisy, and Alice chose scandal and wealth and paid prices we can only partially understand. They were celebrated and condemned, envied and scorned, powerful and powerless at the same time. Their stories remind us that behind every crown is a human being, and sometimes behind that crown are a dozen other human beings whose lives became entangled with royalty in ways that shaped them all. But this is not the end of the story. What happened to Edward's illegitimate children, the ones he never acknowledged? Some lived in obscurity. Others became prominent in society, and at least one may have inherited the throne of another country. That story, the secret bloodline of Edward VII, is even more shocking than his affairs. Want to know which European royal families today may carry the genes of the Playboy king through his illegitimate children? That's a story for another time.